It's a Tuesday evening, late summer, the kind of night where the air still holds heat from the day, but the sky has already gone that deep, bruised purple that tells you autumn is coming for everything. I'm sitting at a rooftop bar in the city, my city, a city I moved to alone, with 2 suitcases and a savings account I'd rebuilt from nothing. I'm wearing a dress I picked out for myself, not because someone said I should dress differently, not because I was trying to impress anyone, just because I saw it and I thought, that looks like me. I have a drink in my hand, a real one, not the kind you nervously sip to have something to do with your hands. I'm in the middle of a conversation with a group of women I met 6 months ago at a writing workshop, and we are laughing. The kind of laughing that comes from somewhere so deep in your chest that you don't care what you look like doing it. And then I see him, across the bar, standing with a group of people, a little older looking than I remembered, a little softer somehow. He's scanning the room the way people do when they're looking for someone to recognize them, and his eyes land on me. And they stop. I watch his face go through about 4 different emotions in 3 seconds. And do you know what I felt? Nothing. Not the sharp, electric nothing of forced indifference, not the careful, practiced nothing of someone who's been rehearsing for this moment. Just nothing. The smooth, easy, uncluttered nothing of a person who has genuinely moved on, who has built something so full and so real that there is simply no room left for the old wound to breathe. I smiled. Not at him. I smiled at something my friend had just said, and then I turned back to my table. That was the moment I knew I had won. Not won against him, won against the version of me that almost let one person's cruelty decide my entire story. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being left. The person who walks away does not take your future with them. They only take the future you were building for them. And when I understood that, really understood it, in my bones, I stopped mourning what I'd lost, and I started building what I was owed. I didn't scream, I didn't fight back, I just became someone they never expected. This story isn't about revenge. I need to say that again because I mean it in a way that might surprise you. This story is not about revenge. It's not about proving him wrong, though that happened. It's not about making him regret, though I imagine he does. It's not about being seen or being chosen or being validated by the person who discarded you. Because, and I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it, you do not need their approval to confirm what you already are. This story is about becoming. It's about the strange, painful, magnificent process of being cracked open by loss and choosing, actively, daily, sometimes hourly choosing, to pour light into the fractures instead of letting them fill with bitterness. This is a long one. Get comfortable, make tea, get a journal if you have one, because there are things in this story that I want you to write down for yourself. And if this kind of story feeds something in you, if you are someone who believes in radical self-transformation, who believes that the best chapters of your life might be the ones that start in the middle of your worst moment, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly you. Let's go back to the beginning. I was 26 years old when Daniel told me I wasn't fun enough for him. I want to say that slowly so it can sit. 26 years old, which means I was young enough to believe it completely, old enough to feel like there was no time left to become something different, and exactly the right kind of tired to have nothing left to argue with. We had been together for 3 years during which I had made myself smaller in approximately 1,000 different ways that I am only now able to count. I canceled plans with my own friends when he wanted to stay in. I stopped suggesting restaurants he might not like. I dressed differently, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way water reshapes a stone. I wore less color. I talked less about my interests. I started prefacing my opinions with, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but until the disclaimer became reflex, until I genuinely couldn't tell where his preferences ended and my personality began. And here is the part that hurts the most to say out loud. I thought I was being a good partner. I genuinely believed that accommodation was love, that the measure of how much you care about someone is how much of yourself you're willing to sand away for them. Nobody taught me that explicitly. It was just the water I swam in, the model I absorbed from 100 small moments, my mother adjusting her laugh so it wasn't too loud in company, women in movies softening themselves to be more palatable to the men they loved, the slow cultural messaging that a woman who takes up space is difficult, is too much, is not the kind of woman a man wants to stay with. And so I made myself easier to stay with. And he stayed. For 3 years he stayed. And I told myself that was proof I was doing something right. Let me tell you who I was before Daniel, because I need you to understand what I gave away. I was the girl who read everything. Not just novels, philosophy, psychology, history, science journalism, weird academic papers I found on the internet at 2 in the morning because a thought had snagged in my brain and I couldn't let it go. I had opinions. I had passionate, embarrassing, wonderful opinions about things like urban planning and folk music and the history of color dyes in medieval Europe and why certain kinds of architecture make people feel lonely. I was curious, in a way that made people either light up or feel exhausted, and honestly, both reactions were fine with me, because I learned early that not everyone is your person, and your job is to find the ones who are. I painted. Badly, beautifully, joyfully. I painted in a corner of my apartment with house paint and cheap brushes because I didn't care about the output. I only cared about the process, the way time disappeared, the way my brain went quiet. I danced in my kitchen. I sang too loudly in the car. I made elaborate, unnecessary playlists for ordinary moments, songs for a rainy Thursday, songs for when you almost call someone you shouldn't, songs for feeling 22 on a Wednesday. I had a whole inner world that was rich and strange and completely, unapologetically mine. And then I met someone who thought it was a lot. The first sign was small. It always is. About 4 months into dating Daniel, we were at a dinner party hosted by his work friends. I got into a conversation with someone I think it was about the psychology of boredom, actually, whether boredom is a skill some people have lost. I was animated. I was excited. I completely forgot where I was for a few minutes because the conversation was good, and my whole body goes into this mode when a conversation is good, where I lean forward and I talk with my hands, and my voice gets a little louder. On the drive home, Daniel said, quiet and careful, "You kind of took over that conversation, you know?" I said I didn't realize. He said, "I just think sometimes you can be a lot for people." He said it gently, concerned, like he was doing me a favor, and maybe he even believed that. But what I heard in the part of me that was young and uncertain and desperate to be loved was, "You are too much. You need to be smaller. You need to be less." And I filed that away. I didn't confront it. I didn't push back. I just filed it, the way you file away a new rule when you're learning how to exist in a new place. And over the next 2.5 years, I followed that rule carefully, diligently. I became quieter at parties. I asked more questions and offered fewer opinions. I learned how to redirect conversations away from things I cared about toward things he cared about. I streamlined. I compressed. I made myself manageable. And here's the gut punch. It worked. He seemed more comfortable with me. He seemed pleased with me. And because his pleasure registered to my nervous system as love, I felt like I was succeeding. We had a good life on paper, a routine that felt stable, weekends that had a pleasant shape to them. I had a job I was fine at, not the job I had originally wanted, but the one I had made pragmatic peace with. I had drifted from my closest friends over the years, not because of any fight, just because I was always prioritizing the relationship, always making myself available in that specific direction, and friendships drift when you stop showing up to them. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I was numb in a way I had learned to call contentment. And then he met her. I won't say her name because this story isn't about her. She did nothing wrong to me, technically. She existed. She was, from what I gathered, everything I had trained myself not to be. Loud, spontaneous, someone who would suggest at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday that they drive 4 hours to see the sunrise from a mountain. Someone who organized elaborate themed dinners and made friends at bars with complete strangers and existed in the world like the world was a party that had been waiting for her to arrive. Fun. She was, by all accounts, fun. He told me about her. Not the way you confess, but the way you justify. Over coffee on a Sunday morning, in the apartment we had been talking about making more permanent. He told me that they had been spending time together, that he had developed feelings, that he needed to be honest with me. And then he said the sentence that I have spent the better part of 2 years turning over and over in my hands. I love you, but I think I need someone who's more alive, someone who makes life feel like an adventure. I'm not saying anything is wrong with you. I'm just saying that you and I have started to feel like a routine, and I need more than that. More than a routine. More than me. I didn't cry in front of him. I remember that very clearly. I held myself completely still, the way you hold a broken thing carefully, and I said something composed and dignified that I could not now remember at all, and I walked him to the door, and I closed it behind him. And then I sat down on the kitchen floor, and I stayed there for a long time. Because here's the thing about that moment, the thing that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It wasn't just the breakup that was destroying me in that moment. It was the recognition. I recognized with a horrible and sudden clarity that he was not entirely wrong. Not about her, not about the relationship needing to end, but about me, about who I had become, about the fact that somewhere in the last 3 years, somewhere in all the accommodating and the compressing and the making myself manageable, I had genuinely become a quieter, flatter, less vibrant version of myself. I had done such a thorough job of erasing the parts of me he found inconvenient that I had accidentally erased the parts that had made me me. He left me for someone more fun. But I had been the one who made myself boring. That was the thought that broke me open on that kitchen floor. That was the thought I had to crawl through before I could get to anything better. And that's when everything started to change. The weeks that followed are a blur of specific miseries that I think anyone who has been through a significant loss will recognize. I ate badly and slept wrong. I cycled through our relationship in my memory, looking for the moment I could point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. That's where I should have done something different. I texted friends I hadn't properly spoken to in months, and they answered, because that's what good friends do, and I felt the shame of having neglected them alongside the relief of being held. I did some things I'm not proud of. I looked at her social media more than I should have. I compared myself in the merciless and unfair way of someone who is only ever looking for evidence that they are worse. She was photographed at concerts and hiking trails and rooftop bars. She had big, easy smiles in every photo. She looked like someone who had never heard the word manageable and would laugh if you tried to apply it to her. And in those first terrible weeks, here is the story I told myself about those photos. She is everything I am not. He was right. I am not enough. The thoughts were vicious, and they were constant, and they played on a loop that I genuinely was not sure would ever stop. But something else was happening underneath them, something smaller and harder and more stubborn. Underneath the grief and the shame and the obsessive comparison, a question was beginning to form. Not, why wasn't I enough, but who was I before I decided I had to be enough for someone else? That question would take me a long time to answer properly, but the fact that it appeared at all, that somewhere under the rubble, that version of me was still alive enough to ask, that was the first small miracle. It was a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the breakup. I remember the day specifically because Thursday mornings in that season of my life had a particular quality of dread. I worked from home on Thursdays, which meant no structure, no obligation to appear human for anyone, and far too much time alone with my own thoughts. I was sitting at my desk with my laptop open, pretending to work, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I was reading. This is almost too on the nose, but it's true. I was reading an article about boredom, about how boredom is not a passive state, but an active signal, that when we feel bored, it is our mind telling us that the current environment is not offering what we actually need to grow. And something in me stopped, because I thought, I am bored, not boring, bored. I have been bored for years. I have been living in an environment, a relationship, a version of myself that has not been offering me what I need to grow. And I have been interpreting that boredom as evidence that there is something wrong with me, rather than evidence that I have been living too small. I closed the laptop. I made fresh coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with a blank notebook, one of the nice ones I had been saving for something important enough, and I wrote at the top of the first page, "Who was I before I decided I needed to be easier?" And I started writing. Not for any particular purpose, not with any plan. I just started writing, and the things that came out of my pen surprised me, because it turned out she was still in there. That girl I had been, the one who read everything and painted badly and made playlists for ordinary moments, she hadn't gone anywhere. She had just been waiting, quietly, for someone to invite her back. I wrote for 2 hours that morning, and at the end, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind of decision that looks like a montage, one big sweep of music and 100 scenes of reinvention. Just a quiet, private, personal decision, the kind that nobody else would even see me make. I decided to become interested in myself again. Not for him, not to show anyone anything, just because I missed her, the version of me who was curious and loud and unmanageable, and I wanted her back. That was the decision. Everything else came from that. I want to be honest with you about what the first few months looked like, because I think there is a version of this kind of story that makes transformation seem clean and linear and mostly photogenic, and that is not what happened. What happened was I tried things and failed at them. I started habits and dropped them. I had days where I felt genuinely, almost painfully hopeful, and days where I lay on the couch watching reality TV for 6 hours and felt the old voice creeping back in. You're not interesting enough. You're not disciplined enough. You're not the kind of person who actually does the thing. I signed up for a ceramics class in early October, 6 weeks after the breakup. I had always been intrigued by it, the idea of making something with your hands that could hold water, that had practical use and physical permanence. I was terrible at it. My first bowl came out looking like a crime. My instructor, a woman in her 50s who had the kind of weathered, contented energy of someone who has genuinely stopped caring what anyone thinks, held it up and said with complete sincerity, "Good, you're learning what clay doesn't want to do." I think about that line a lot now, learning what clay doesn't want to do. The idea that failure is not a verdict, it's just information. I kept going to the class. I also started running, which is hilarious to me because I had always had a particular contempt for running as a hobby. It seemed like a thing people did to punish themselves, this joyless, rhythmic suffering in public. But I needed something I could do alone, at any hour, with no equipment and no one to let down if I quit early. And somewhere around week 3, something shifted. The suffering became a kind of meditation. The rhythmic suffering, as I had so eloquently called it, became the thing that quieted the voice. I ran 2 miles the first week, 3 miles the second. By week 8, I ran a 10K for the first time in my life, alone, on a Sunday morning before the city fully woke up, and I cried at the end. Not sad crying, not the kind I had been doing for weeks, but a completely different kind, almost indistinguishable from laughter. I didn't post it anywhere. Nobody knew. That felt important, something that was only mine. I should tell you about the friends because they are a crucial part of this story that often gets left out of glow-up narratives. I had a best friend named Priya, who I had seen exactly 4 times in the 2 years before the breakup. Not 4 times a month, 4 times total. She lived 20 minutes away. She had been one of the most important people in my life before Daniel, and I had slowly, gradually, without ever meaning to, deprioritized her to the point where we had become the kind of friends who only spoke in bursts when something was wrong. When Daniel left, I called her. She answered on the second ring. She said, "It's about time." She didn't mean it cruelly. She meant it the way the people who love you best can mean things, with a directness born of care, the kind that says, "I have been watching you disappear for years, and I am so relieved you are calling me back from the edge of that." We started having dinner every Thursday. Not a vague "we should hang out," every Thursday. At her place or mine. Nothing fancy, just presence. And in those dinners, something happened that I had forgotten was possible. I started talking again about what I actually thought, about what I actually felt, about the strange, private, embarrassing interior of a life in progress. And Priya would talk back with her own full weight. No one performing, no one editing themselves, just two people reminding each other that they are interesting and complicated and worth the time. I cannot overstate what this did for me. Being seen, truly, carefully seen by someone who chooses to see you is a fundamental human need, and I had been starving for it for years without realizing it, feeding myself the thin substitute of being tolerated. It was Priya who first said, about 4 months into our Thursday dinners, "You know you've changed, right? Like something is happening to you. You seem more like yourself." I held onto that for weeks. Let me tell you about the work, because I don't want this to sound effortless. I was working at the time as a project coordinator at a mid-sized marketing firm. The job was fine in the specific way that things are fine when you have stopped expecting them to be good. I was competent, I was reliable, I was never the person anyone worried about, and also never the person anyone was particularly excited about. I had, somewhere along the way, made peace with being a solid B player. In the months after the breakup, as I was in the process of recovering the version of me who gave a damn about things, I started caring about my work again. Not in a desperate, try-too-hard way, but in the quiet, stubborn way of someone who remembers they have standards. I had a skill I had never properly developed: writing. Not the writing I did at work, the functional, process-driven communication of project management, but actual writing, ideas and arguments and stories. I had kept a private blog for years, an embarrassing personal document that maybe 12 people had ever read, and I started writing on it again, first once a week, then more. I got good. Not because I had some sudden talent I hadn't had before, but because I was finally willing to do the work of getting good. I read books about craft. I studied writers I admired not just for pleasure, but for technique. I wrote things that weren't working and rewrote them again. By month 5, I had a portfolio of pieces I was proud of. By month 6, I used that portfolio to apply for a communications role at a nonprofit I genuinely cared about, an organization working on education access, and I got it. A 22% salary increase, work that felt like it mattered, a team that expected me to have ideas and was disappointed when I didn't. The first week in that job, I sat in a meeting and said something, offered a perspective that I had been thinking about, and my new director stopped and said, "That's a really interesting angle. I want to think about that." I had to stop myself from saying, "I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but..." I just said, "Thank you. I can send you something more developed if it would be useful." Small, so small, but I felt something click back into place in my ribcage. I need to tell you about the processing, the actual emotional work, because it would be dishonest to present transformation as simply a matter of adding good habits. The habits matter. The running, the ceramics, the writing, the friendships, the new job. But underneath all of it, I was doing the harder, less visible, less Instagrammable work of actually sitting with what had happened. I started therapy about 3 months in. I want to say that clearly and without any softening, because I know there are people watching this who are afraid of that word, who have been taught that needing help is weakness, and I want to offer my own experience as direct contradiction to that. My therapist's name was Sarah. She was precise and warm and occasionally challenging in ways that made me want to argue with her, which I later learned was a sign she was doing her job well. In our early sessions, I kept returning to the same question in different costumes. What is wrong with me that he needed to find someone more interesting? And Sarah, every time, would redirect it. Not dismiss it, redirect. She would say, I hear you asking what's wrong with you. I'm curious whether you've considered what you were looking for from him that you weren't getting. That took a long time to crack open, what I was looking for from him that I wasn't getting. Eventually, slowly, gradually, with the painstaking progress of someone learning a new language, I came to understand something. I had chosen Daniel in part because he made me feel safe to be small. He was calm where I was sometimes chaotic, contained where I was sometimes overflowing, and I had unconsciously interpreted his steadiness as evidence that he was the appropriate check on my excess. I had not been shrinking myself because he forced me to. I had been shrinking myself because I was afraid of my own size. I was afraid of being too much. I was afraid that the full, unedited version of me was too loud, too weird, too passionate, too present, that she was, as he had once gently suggested, a lot for people. And he had confirmed that fear, not by creating it, but by echoing it. When I understood that, when I could really feel it, not just intellectually, but in my body, something shifted in the story I told about the breakup. It stopped being the story of a man who left me because I wasn't enough. It became the story of a woman who had been not enough to herself for a very long time, and who had finally found a reason to stop. He hadn't broken me. He had cracked a shell I'd built over my own brightness. And that's when everything started to change. 8 months in. I want to give you a snapshot because I think snapshots are more honest than montages. I wake up at 6:15 a.m. without an alarm most mornings. Not because I forced myself to become a morning person. I am constitutionally not a morning person, and I fought that fact for most of my 20s, but because I began to want that first hour so badly that my body started producing it for me. That hour is mine. Coffee, journal, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting with the particular quality of early morning silence that feels like the day hasn't made up its mind yet. I run 4 days a week. I've completed 2 10Ks and registered for a half marathon I have not yet told anyone about because I want it to be mine for a little longer. I go to the ceramics studio every Saturday. My bowls are now objects a person could plausibly use. I've started experimenting with glaze in ways my instructor calls chaotic but intentionally so, which I have accepted as the highest possible compliment. I have read 34 books so far this year, not as a challenge, not toward a goal, just because I had remembered that I love reading, the way I had apparently forgotten I was supposed to love breathing. I have dinner with Priya every Thursday and brunch with 3 other women every other Sunday, women I met through work and through the ceramics class and through the simple, radical practice of showing up consistently to things until the right people notice you and stay. I have been writing consistently, not for any external reason, just because the writing makes me more myself, more legible to myself, more capable of knowing what I actually think. And something has changed that is harder to describe than the running miles or the books read or the salary increase. Something has changed in how I take up space. I talk at meetings now the way I talked at that dinner party 6 years ago, before I learned to preface everything with, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I talk with my hands. My voice has something in it that I can only call weight. Not loudness, not performance, but a quality of meaning it, of being present in the thing I'm saying. I walk differently. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I promise you it's true. I walk like someone who has a direction and expects to get there. People have started to comment on it. Strangers, colleagues, people who knew me before. Not all at once, subtly, incrementally, the way changes always register when they're real rather than performed. A colleague who had worked alongside me for 2 years said, out of nowhere, on an ordinary Wednesday, "You seem different lately. Good different, like you figured something out." I said, "I think I did." The first signs that things were shifting came, as first signs tend to, from unexpected directions. My writing. I submitted a piece to a mid-sized digital publication that had been on my radar for years, the kind of publication I had always thought was for people more qualified, or more confident, or more something than me. The piece was personal, about what it means to build a life from scratch in your late 20s, about the specific terror and specific freedom of that. They accepted it. They published it. The response was, I don't have a word for it that doesn't sound like ego. It reached people. That's what I mean. It reached people in the way that honest writing does when the person writing it has actually lived through the thing they're describing. Strangers sent me messages about their own experiences. Women who had been through similar losses wrote to say they recognized themselves. A woman from somewhere in the Midwest said she read it 3 times and forwarded it to her sister who was going through a divorce. I read every message. I still have them saved. That experience, being not just seen, but used, being useful, having the thing that came out of the hardest period of my life become something that helped someone else feel less alone in theirs, that cracked something open in me that no amount of self-improvement habit tracking could have reached. I started writing more, pitching more. By the end of month 9, I had published 4 pieces in 3 different publications. A small audience had begun to follow my work. I had become, almost accidentally, someone with a point of view worth reading. Let me tell you about the internal shift, because it's the one that mattered most. There came a point, I can't pinpoint the exact day, but it was somewhere around month 10, where I realized I had stopped monitoring myself. For years, I had lived with a constant background process running. How am I coming across right now? Am I too much? Am I being difficult? Is this the right amount of me for this situation? It was exhausting in the way that only truly habitual things are exhausting. Not the acute exhaustion of a hard day, but the chronic exhaustion of a body under constant low-grade vigilance. And then, at some point, it stopped. Not all at once, not with any dramatic intervention, just gradually. The background process quieted, and I found myself, startlingly, then comfortably, simply present in my own life, saying things without reviewing them first, laughing without checking whether my laugh was appropriate, having opinions and expressing them without the preparatory apology. It's hard to explain how strange that was, how strange and how good. Like walking into a room and realizing you've been carrying a very heavy coat for so long that you forgot you were wearing it, and then you set it down and the lightness is almost disorienting. And that's when everything started to change. But by this point, the change was no longer happening to me. The change had become me. I want to explain the difference. In the early months, transformation felt like something I was doing to myself. I was adding habits, subtracting patterns, building scaffolding around the person I was trying to become. It felt effortful because it was, genuinely, exhaustingly effortful, the way learning a new language is effortful, the way any new skill is effortful before it becomes fluent. By month 18, 19, 20, the effort had become identity. The running wasn't something I was disciplining myself to do, it was something I was. The writing wasn't a project I was working on, it was how I processed the world. The curiosity, the loudness, the passionate, embarrassing opinions about interesting things. They weren't a project of self-reclamation, they were just me. Finally, irreversibly, mercifully, me. I want to tell you about a moment from around month 11 that I keep close because it taught me something essential. I was at a work event. The nonprofit was celebrating a successful campaign, low-key, drinks and snacks in the office, and I was talking with a colleague I liked, a man about my age who was funny and easy to be around. We were in the middle of a conversation that had started about something work-related and had drifted, the way good conversations do, into something more personal. He was asking me about the ceramics. I had mentioned it in passing weeks earlier, and he had remembered, which told me something. And I was describing this piece I was working on, a tall vase with an uneven rim that I had done on purpose. I had made it asymmetrical on purpose because I'd gotten interested in what Japanese aesthetics call wabi-sabi, the beauty of the imperfect and impermanent, and I was trying to make something that honored that instead of fighting it. And he stopped me, just stopped mid-conversation, and said, "You are one of the most genuinely interesting people I've met in years." I looked at him for a second, waiting for the but, the qualifier, the gently delivered suggestion that I could stand to dial it back. It didn't come. He just said what he said and meant it. And I said, "Thank you. That's a really nice thing to hear." No disclaimer, no deflection, no, I don't know, I'm probably overthinking it. Just, thank you. I drove home that night with the windows down, and I sang too loudly in the car for the first time in longer than I could remember. Pause. I wasn't boring. I had been hidden. There's a difference, and understanding it changed everything. I need to tell you about seeing Daniel before I tell you about the rooftop bar, because the rooftop bar was the second time. The first time was more unexpected, more raw, and in some ways more important. It was month 13. I had been at a gallery opening, my first. A friend of a friend had work in a small show, abstract paintings in a converted warehouse space, the kind of event I would have previously found intimidating and found reasons not to attend. I went because I was practicing showing up to things. I was standing in front of a large red canvas, something in my chest responding to it before my brain had a chance to catch up and explain why, when I heard a voice I knew. He was across the room. He was with her. She was exactly what I had imagined, bright, loud in the good way, gesturing broadly as she described something to the person next to her. She looked like someone who had never been told she was too much for anyone. I felt the old punch of comparison start, and then something different happened. It landed softer than I expected. I watched her for a moment, and instead of the familiar sear of inadequacy, I felt something closer to recognition, and maybe even something that was trying to be respect, though I wasn't quite there yet. She was doing the thing I had been trying to learn. She was just being herself, unreservedly, in public, with no apology. She was everything I had been before I had sanded it away, and she had nothing I didn't have back. Daniel saw me a few minutes later. He came over. Of course, he came over. He had always been fundamentally a person of good manners, whatever else he was, and leaving would have been uncomfortable. He said, "Hey," with a smile that had things behind it I didn't have time to catalog. I said, "Hey," with a smile that had nothing behind it except the genuine mild surprise of running into an old chapter of your life. We did the dance, the brief, civilized, slightly surreal dance of two people who once knew each other's sleeping habits and grocery lists, and now exist in each other's orbits as polite strangers. He asked how I was. I said well. He asked what I'd been up to. And here is the moment I want to sit with for a minute. I told him. I told him about the new job, about the writing and where it had been published, about the ceramics and the half-marathon training and the trip to Portugal I was planning solo for the spring. I did not perform any of it. I did not curate it or strategize it or deliver it with one eye on his reaction. I just told him, the way you tell someone you don't particularly need anything from. And I watched his face do something interesting, something I can only describe as recalibration, like a person encountering an object they thought they knew and realizing the measurements are different from what they remembered. He said, "You seem really good." I said, "I am." No question mark, no I think, or I'm trying to be, or it's a process, just I am. He said something about keeping in touch, the kind of thing people say when they don't mean it, but mean it kindly, and I said something equally meaningless and equally kind, and I went back to standing in front of the red painting, and I felt it again, that enormous, smooth nothing, not emptiness, not suppression, just the quiet, spacious absence of a wound that has finished healing. I had stood in the same room as him and not needed anything from the encounter. That was month 13. The rooftop bar was month 17. By then, the nothing had had 4 more months to solidify into something even better, indifference that had become so comfortable it was almost affectionate, the kind of feeling you have toward a place you used to live. You can revisit it without pain, you can even appreciate what it gave you, but you have no desire to go back. I was with my friends, Priya and 2 women from my writing group, and a woman I had met at my first 10K who had become one of the most important presences in my life. We were loud, we were taking up space. I had my back to most of the bar. When I saw him, I was already mid-laugh. I registered his presence the way you register weather. Noted, filed, not requiring response. His eyes found me and stopped as I said. I saw the 4-second catalog of emotions on his face. I saw the moment he decided to come over and the moment he decided against it. I saw in that moment something I can only call regret. And here is where I have to be very careful and very honest. I did not feel triumphant. Not the sharp, hot triumph I might have imagined feeling when I was sitting on my kitchen floor in month 1, building fantasies of vindication. What I felt was quieter and more complex than that. I felt something adjacent to gratitude. Because here is the truth that I had been arriving at slowly for 17 months, and which crystallized in that moment of catching his eye across a rooftop bar. He did me a favor. Not the favor he thought he was doing, not the clean break he told himself was honest, but the favor of the catalyst, of the crack in the shell, of the ending that made the beginning possible. If he had stayed, I would have continued. I would have continued being smaller and quieter and more manageable, and I would have continued calling that love, and I would have continued not knowing what I was sitting on. The leaving, as cruel and as careless as it felt in the moment, was the door. I turned back to my table. My friend was finishing a story that ended in a punchline that made all 4 of us inhale with laughter. I put my hand on Priya's arm. I picked up my drink. I did not look back. I want to tell you about his text, because there was a text, which surprised me and then surprised me that I was surprised, because of course there was a text. That's what people do when they see someone who has clearly surpassed the version they remembered. They reach out. Not always with any particular plan, just with the impulse to reconnect, to see if the door is still open, to re-enter a story that ended and find out if there's a new chapter they could be a part of. He texted the next morning. "Really nice to see you last night. You seem amazing. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, honestly. Would you want to get coffee sometime?" I read it 3 times, not because I was uncertain about what to do with it, but because I wanted to make sure I understood what I was actually feeling before I responded. I felt, in order, surprise, a brief flash of something I can only call muscle memory, the pull of the familiar, not desire, just the automatic response of a body that once organized itself around this person, and then clarity. I put the phone down, I made coffee, I went for a run, a long one, 8 miles along a route I had mapped out weeks earlier and kept meaning to try. I came home, I showered, I sat at my desk, and I wrote for an hour, something I was working on for a publication that had recently approached me rather than the other way around. And then I picked up the phone and I wrote back, "It was good to see you too. I hope you're doing well." That was all. No coffee, no closure conversation, no reopening. Not because I was punishing him, I want to be clear about that. Withholding coffee from someone is not revenge. It is just a woman making an accurate assessment of what she needs and what she doesn't, and responding accordingly. I didn't need coffee with Daniel. I needed, and had, everything else. He wrote back, "That's it?" I didn't answer that one. I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think is important and that is easy to miss in this kind of story: the fake reunion attempts. The way people who watched you change from a distance sometimes try to retroactively claim a place in the narrative. In the months after the rooftop bar, I heard from a few people from that period of my life. A cousin who had always been politely skeptical of me and was now suddenly curious. A former colleague from the job I had left who reached out to say he'd read my work and couldn't believe I'd been sitting across the hall the whole time. A woman from Daniel's friend group who wanted to meet for drinks and spent the entire time asking me leading questions about my new life in a way I recognized as intelligence gathering rather than genuine connection. And here is what I want to say about that, about the people who show up after the transformation. Some of them are genuine. Some people see you change and something in them is genuinely moved, genuinely inspired, genuinely happy for you in a way that asks for nothing in return. These people are worth your time and your warmth. And some of them, not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, want something from your glow. They want proximity to it. They want to be in the updated story. They want the validation of being associated with someone who turned out to be remarkable. Learning to tell the difference was one of the more important skills I developed in that second year. The test I used, and still use: does this person know me, or are they interested in the idea of me? The people who know you show up in the boring moments, the unremarkable Tuesdays, the moments before the glow. The people who are interested in the idea of you show up for the highlight reel. Both groups deserve your kindness. Only one deserves your inner circle. I kept my inner circle small, and I kept it ferociously. Priya, my writing group friends, the woman from the 10K, my therapist, a few people from the new job who had shown me who they were in ordinary circumstances and turned out to be extraordinary people. That was enough. That was more than enough. And that's when everything started to change. But by this point, the change was no longer happening to me. The change had become me. And what I understood standing at month 20-something with a half-marathon medal and a published portfolio and a full, complicated, gorgeous life, what I understood was that the revenge I had fantasized about in those first dark weeks was not only not the point, it was actually the wrong metric entirely. I had not become remarkable in order to show him what he'd lost. I had become remarkable because it turned out I had always been remarkable, and all it had taken was someone removing the obstacle, even if that obstacle was love, even if losing it had been the most painful thing I'd ever experienced, for me to remember that. He had not broken me. He had accidentally, at great personal cost to me, broken me free. The best revenge is living well. You've heard that. It's one of those phrases that gets embroidered on things and shared as a caption and mostly drained of its actual meaning by overuse. But I want to give it back its meaning because it contains something true and something easily misunderstood. The living well part is not performative. It's not the highlight reel. It's not the salary and the publications and the ceramics and the half marathon and the rooftop bar. Those are the evidence of the living well, not the living well itself. The living well is the hour in the morning that belongs to you, the run where the only sound is your own breathing, the conversation with Priya on a Thursday where both of you say exactly what you think, the Saturday in the studio where you lose track of time, the moment you say something real in a meeting and someone says, "That's interesting," and you think, I know it is." The living well is the quiet, daily practice of choosing yourself, not instead of loving others, not as a rejection of connection, but as the foundation on which genuine connection can actually happen. Here's what I want you to hear if you're sitting with a loss right now. If someone told you, with words or with their leaving, that you weren't enough. If you're on the floor right now, metaphorically or otherwise, wondering if this is the part where your story ends. It isn't. This is the part where your story starts. Not in spite of what just happened, because of it. The crack is where the light gets in, which I know is another phrase that's been drained of meaning. So let me say what I actually mean. The loss is the invitation. The pain is the signal. What it's signaling is you were living too small, and you know it, and it's time to stop. Here is practical advice because I promised I would give you some. 1. Start with a question, not a goal. Not, I want to be someone who does X. Ask, who was I before I decided I had to be manageable? Write the answer down. Actually, write it. 2. Start one thing, not a program, not a plan, not a complete overhaul. One thing that you are doing for yourself alone, not for productivity, not for outcome, not for anyone else to see. Run 2 miles, join a class, open the notebook, start the one thing. 3. Call the person, the friend you've been meaning to call, the person who knew you when you were still yourself. Call them not with an apology for the gap, but with your full attention. Show up. 4. Do the work underneath the habits. The habits matter, I promise they matter, but underneath them, do the harder work. Figure out what the loss was really telling you about where you had stopped showing up for yourself. That's the work that doesn't look like work, but changes everything. 5. Stop monitoring yourself. This is the hardest one, and I have no efficient method to offer. But every time you catch yourself about to say, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but before a thing you actually believe, stop. Say the thing. Let yourself take up the space your thoughts are entitled to. And on the days when you can't do any of that, on the days when you're back on the kitchen floor and the voice is loud and the progress feels like it was a story you told yourself, on those days, this is what I want you to remember. She is still in there. The version of you that was curious and loud and unmanageable and fully, joyfully, unapologetically herself. She has not gone anywhere. She is just waiting for you to invite her back. She is worth the effort of finding her. I am still a work in progress. I want you to know that. There are days I doubt, and days I compare, and days when the old voice gets a word in edgewise. Transformation is not a destination you arrive at and then stay at. It's a direction. But I know the direction now. I know what it feels like to be headed the right way. And I know with every certainty in me that there is nothing anyone could say to me or leave me for or take from me that would make me go back to being smaller. I have met myself. I like her. She is, for the record, a lot. And that is exactly the point. What's your glow-up story? I mean that as a real question, not a call to fill the comments, though please fill the comments, but as a genuine invitation, because I believe that these stories, the ones where people are cracked open and choose to pour light into the cracks rather than bitterness, these are the stories that actually change things, that reach through a screen and find someone on a kitchen floor and say, you are not done. This is not the end. The story is starting. Tell me yours. I read every single one. If this reached something in you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and I'll see you in the next one.